We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the first webinar in our Misunderstood Species series. My name is Regan Downey, and I'm the Director of Education and Advocacy here at the Wolf Conservation Center, and I'll be moderating tonight's program along with Dr. Joey Hinton, the Wolf Conservation Center Senior Research Scientist. The Wolf Conservation Center works to advance the survival of wolves by inspiring a global community through education, advocacy, research, and recovery, and we're funded entirely by people like you, so thank you. Our scientific webinar series allows us to bridge the gap between research and the general public, which allows for engaging discussions and increased advocacy. Our Misunderstood Species webinar series is designed to shed light on the myths and misconceptions surrounding some of our world's most vital wild animals like sharks, bats, wolves, and coyotes. By deepening our understanding of their behaviors, we can work towards a peaceful coexistence and build a world where wolves and their misunderstood counterparts can thrive. We're so excited to welcome Dr. Michael Byrne, an Associate Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Missouri. Mike will talk about Shortfin Mako sharks and highlight conditions that seem to limit where they can travel in the Pacific Ocean. He'll also touch on conservation issues facing Mako sharks in the Atlantic Ocean. Mike's research covers multiple species, from raccoons to raptors to wolves and sharks. He is focused on better understanding these misunderstood species and improving the public's perception. His ultimate goal is to shift the cultural narrative from fear to respect and ensure sharks continue to thrive in the world's oceans for generations to come. Before we begin, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping tips. You can use two Zoom features to communicate with us. You can use the chat feature for general commentary and the Q&A box for questions. We'll have a designated question and answer section at the end of the webinar. If you would like a question to be answered, you must type that into the Q&A box. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Wolf Conservation Center's YouTube channel within the next week. With that, Mike, I'll toss things over to you.
Cool. Hello. Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. Well, I can't see, but I hope you're watching along. So yeah, we're going to talk about sharks today. But since this is for the Wolf Conservation Center, I want to take a moment and just put forth that I do have wolf bona fides. So I'm talking about sharks today, but I have done wolf research in the past, so I'm part of the pack, at least a little bit here. Picture on the left is, let me get my laser pointer going. This is me putting a GPS collar on a wolf in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And then Joey Hinton actually took this picture on the right when I went and visited him, and that's a red wolf in the red wolf recovery area. So we're talking about sharks today, but I've got some wolf background. Okay, let's get to the star of today's show. It is this guy right here. So this boing is a short-fin Mako shark, probably my favorite animal. This is a video that was taken off Cabo San Lucas a few years ago. If you're ever in Cabo in the spring, you can pay a boat to take you out to the open ocean to swim around with Mako sharks. Highly recommend it. So if you're not super familiar with Mako sharks, I'll give kind of a background of some of the cool stuff about them. So here's our guy right here. So there's a few things that kind of make Mako sharks particularly interesting in the shark world. The first being that they are warm-bodied, or endothermic if you want to be cool and scientific about it, or you could say warm-blooded. So kind of like us, but a little bit different. So they have this interesting kind of counter-current heat exchange mechanism that allows them to keep their internal body temperature several degrees warmer than the water that surrounds them. The way it works is they have this sort of internal core of red muscle. As they swim, it heats up, and then the circulatory system takes that heat and dissipates it to other part of the body, which helps keep them warm, which helps keep them fast, which is something we're going to talk about. They're not the only sharks that have this. If you look at the picture of the Mako shark on the screen, you might be able to guess some of their close relatives who's come into the family cookout. And so they are in the laminid family, so their close relatives are these guys. So they are closely in the same family as the white shark, who everybody I think knows the white shark, but also the salmon sharks in the Pacific Ocean, poor beagle sharks in the Atlantic and the Southern Oceans, and then the kind of mysterious longfin Mako shark, which we don't know too much about. So these are these are the close relatives of the Makos, and all these guys have that sort of warm body. So that's one cool thing about Makos. Another cool thing about Makos is that they're fast. They are the fastest shark. They are probably one of the fastest fish. Um, Mako sharks eat fast things, so they are pelagic fish. They live out in the open ocean, and they are preying on things like tuna, like swordfish, like small dolphins, things that are fast. So if you're going to eat fast things in the open ocean, you need to also be fast to catch them. So, they've got this, we call this fusiform body shape, this kind of torpedo shape. They've got this symmetrical lunate tail that generates a lot of power. Their denticles, the scales on a shark, reduce drag in the water. They've been clocked at about 31 miles per hour. One estimate has them going up to 46, although the accuracy on those estimates is hard to judge completely, but they're a pretty fast fish. As you can see, this one is not having much of an issue keeping up with these lures being trolled behind this boat. And I think we're going to get a chomp. Boink. So because they're fast, they are a pretty popular sport fish in some areas, right? You can catch them and they'll run fast and they jump and they put up a good fight. So that's just a little bit of background about the biology of the shark itself. Of course, we can't have nice things. So in 2019, IUCN put them on the red list as an endangered species. And the big thing that causes them to be endangered, sort of their big threat, by far is overfishing. So mako sharks, one of their downsides for them is that, unlike a lot of other sharks, they taste good. The meat is kind of similar to swordfish. So a lot of fishers don't target mako sharks, but they live in the same areas that swordfish live in and tuna live in. So fishers targeting those fish will often catch mako sharks. And traditionally, if you caught a mako shark and you were a fisher, you could sell that mako shark for money because the meat is valuable. And so we kind of run into this overfishing problem. So ICAT, which is sort of the international organization that's responsible for managing tunas and billfish and shark in the Atlantic Ocean, their last stock assessment did show that the population was overfished in the Atlantic Ocean, which is where a lot of the overfishing issues are. To show you some examples from some of my previous research of, how much overfishing could be, show an example of one shark. So this is a shark that we tagged off of Maryland back in 2013. Tagged at the end of May. And what you're looking at here, this is the daily location of the shark as it was moving through the ocean until September 2nd. And then we noticed the track started doing something a little different. Suddenly it started making a beeline to a port in Nova Scotia. Now, sharks don't normally have to go to port to rest. So what happened here is that a longline boat, a commercial fishing boat, had caught this mako shark, and the tag actually tracked the boat going back to the port, which is kind of interesting because we could see, where the fisher was based out of. So we had published this data a few years ago, and what you're looking at here, this is about 30 sharks in the Atlantic Ocean that were tagged either off the northeast coast or off the coast of Mexico here. The dots are shark locations, and then all of the red triangles are spots where the sharks were captured by fishermen, and you can see the ports that they were taken to. So you can see that, they were being captured kind of all over the Atlantic Ocean. And these little polygons that you see here are the EEZs. They're kind of the portions of the ocean that are controlled by individual countries. So you got a large ranging predator, but they get sniped, for lack of a better word, by fishers from kind of all over the Atlantic. The bad news about this is that Mako sharks are an animal that cannot take a lot of fishing pressure. If you look on this chart here, we have the generation time, so basically how long it takes for the population generational turnover. And on this axis, we have the annual rate of population increase. And Mako sharks are way on the bad end here, where their generation times are very long. And even in good conditions, their population doesn't grow very fast, which you might make sense for a top level predator, like a wolf or a bear on land, kind of the same thing, apex predators. There's not really meant to be a ton of them because of the way the ecology works out, but that makes them susceptible to overfishing. A mako shark, a female takes about 18 years to reach maturity, and then she's only given birth, every 2 to 3 years to a relatively small litter. So unlike something like a tuna, where you can fish out a lot of tuna, but then each tuna that's left is going to produce, thousands of eggs next year, mako sharks don't really have that ability to bounce back. The good news, finally some conservation action being taken to help mako sharks. So in the Atlantic, there was a retention ban put in place in 2022, an international retention ban, where no fishers are allowed to keep mako sharks. Right? If they catch one alive, it's got to be let go. If they bring one back and it's already dead, they still can't keep it. They've got to discard it. The goal being to reduce overall fishing mortality and also hopefully change fishers' habits to avoid catching them. Where, previously, if you were fishing for swordfish and you caught a mako shark, you'd be like, oh, okay, I can sell this mako shark. Now if you're out there fishing for swordfish and you catch a mako shark, it's a waste of a hook and it's a waste of your time. And so you might do something to avoid catching mako sharks in the first place. So this is relatively new. It's going to take a while to learn how effective this is. I got a bit of research going on in this realm. It's not really going to talk about today because we're still putting that through peer review. It's a little depressing, but I wanted to touch on sort of some of the conservation issues that they face before jumping a little bit more into sort of an ecology story. So let's pivot away from the gross picture of the dead makos and let's talk about tracking makos in the open ocean. So a lot of my research, whether I'm studying wolves or sharks or whatever the case is, a lot of my interests are in studying animal movements, seeing where animals go, what habitats do they use, how do they migrate. It's the same thing with sharks. But if you look on your screen, you're seeing this is the study area for mako shark research. It's the open ocean, which might lead to the question of, okay, well, how do we track animals in an environment like this? Right? You can't see the shark, it's underwater. You're not going to go follow a shark around, at least not for very long. So how do we get that data on how sharks are moving around in the open ocean? We got two technologies that are commonly used. One are spot tags. So that's me. I need to hire a better field photographer when I'm doing cool stuff, but take my word for it that that's my back right there. These tags, there's a bunch of different configurations, but generally they are attached to the shark's dorsal fin. And then whenever the shark does the jaws thing and the dorsal fin breaks the water, there's a switch on the tag that says, hey, I'm out of water right now. And it sends a signal up to a satellite constellation, the Argos satellite constellation. And if enough of those satellites happen to be above in orbit at that time, they can kind of triangulate a latitude and a longitude from where that ping came from, and you know where your shark was when it came to the surface. So this is a good way for us to track, where sharks are moving in the world. And it works really well with mako sharks because mako sharks tend to spend a lot of time right near the surface. So their fin breaks the surface pretty often. So that helps us track where they're going in the world. But the ocean is three-dimensional, right? So, the other question might be, well, how do we track how these sharks move vertically in the water column? So there's another type of tag that can be used to help us with that. And they're called pop-up satellite archival tags, or if you want to sound cool, around a bunch of shark researchers, call them PSATs, and everyone will know that you're in the club. So this is video, this is taken by one of my grad students. This is actually work that was being done in the Atlantic on the survival of sharks after they're caught by longline fishermen. And I believe this shark was just tagged, and there you can see the tag by the dorsal fin there. So how these tags work is they record depth and temperature at set intervals, and they store all of that information on the tag itself. And then after a predetermined time, the tag is set to detach from the animal. It floats to the surface, and then it transmits all of the data that it's stored on board through satellite system. And the data that you get is going to look something like this from that type of a tag. So this is some data from the project that my grad student was doing. These are 4 sharks. The interesting one to look at here is these tags are set to last for 28 days after we tagged the shark. And so here you have 28 days of a mako shark. Each one of these dots is 5 minutes. So they were recording the depth and the temperature at 5-minute intervals. And you can see the temperature that the shark was experiencing at each of those time points, and then how deep in the water column the shark was from the surface, in this case down to a little bit past 400 meters. But we can look at some of these other sharks here because there's some other interesting stuff just to look at. So this is a study of how well sharks survive if they're caught by accident as bycatch and they're released alive. So this shark up here is an example of a shark that had died a few days after it was released. So you can see the shark swimming, and then where it sinks like a rock. And then once it gets to about 2 kilometers down, it triggers the tag to release before it gets crushed. And then there's the tag floating on the surface. This is a shark where the tag came off the shark prematurely, just a few days after it was tagged. You can see the tag just sitting on the surface. This one is also pretty interesting. So we tagged the shark, and the shark's doing normal shark things. And then you might notice the last few days, the last half of this track, it's still moving up and down in the water column, but the temperature is really warm, no matter where the shark seems to be. What we're pretty sure happened here is that at right around here, this shark, or at least the tag that was on the shark, was eaten by a larger shark. Given the part of the world it's in and the temperature, it probably either a larger mako shark or a white shark would be the culprit here. It must have been fun to pass that tag. So this is the kind of data you get with the PSAT tags. So this is kind of how we can keep track of sharks in the open ocean without having to be on a boat and try to follow them around, which would be ridiculous, but also kind of fun. Okay, so let's get to the story of the Pacific. If you were to go to Google right now and you were to type in where do mako sharks live, you'd probably get a map like this. This is the distribution of where you're going to find mako sharks in the world. They're in all the world's oceans. You can find them in up to relatively high temperate latitudes, all through the tropics. But as you're probably aware, even though this is the range where mako sharks exist, like other animals, there's going to be spots where the animal is more abundant and spots where it's less abundant, and maybe holes in here where you don't really find the critter, right? It's not just evenly distributed mako sharks all throughout that blue. So that gets us to today's story in the Pacific. So we're gonna zoom into the Eastern Pacific. I'm going to show you a bunch of cool data. I think it's cool data. It's this data right here. So orient yourself. We got the California coast right here. This is the Baja Peninsula of Mexico, Sea of Cortez right here. Here's Hawaii. And what you're looking at, each one of these black dots, this is where a shark that was tagged with one of these sharks was on a given day. So it's a daily location of a shark. And with all of these black dots together, there's 87 sharks represented here. with each shark having anywhere from 22 to a little over 1,000 dots. So this is a pretty good data set that shows us, where sharks are moving around in the eastern north part of the Pacific Ocean. And these sharks were mostly tagged in the San Diego area. Now, if, like me, you are a nerd about animal movements and sharks at the same time, you spend a lot of your time just staring at pictures like this. I'm very well socially adjusted and have lots of friends. So you stare at this picture long enough, and you see some cool stuff. One thing about this, I always had a question about because it seemed really weird to me. If you're watching at home, maybe you see the interesting thing too. But what really caught my eye was if you look at these sharks and you look at how far south they're going, there is sort of this weird invisible fence at about 12 degrees latitude. Where sharks come down, and a few of them might go past there, but they turn right around or they hang out, but they kind of get down to about here and then they turn back. Why do they do that? This is an animal that theoretically could travel across ocean basins, lives in the ocean, is highly migratory. What is stopping them from moving past that line with any regularity? So that kind of became a thing in the back of my mind that I had to try and answer. I was losing sleep, staying up all night thinking about it. I'm partly kidding. So I started thinking about what could be causing this. So start thinking about, all right, what's some possible explanations? First off, there's no geographical obstacles, right? There's no land. The water is plenty deep enough. So there's got to be something else going on. So the first thing I thought of was, I think probably the most obvious thing that anyone would think of, that, it's obviously magic and a wizard had put a spell in the Pacific Ocean, which act as a block to Mako sharks, right? And I'm not convinced that's not necessarily true, but scientifically, I couldn't collect the right data to test any hypotheses related to it, so I kind of had to throw that out. So what's the next, most plausible thing looking at this? If you're playing along at home, you might think that, oh, we're getting into the tropics. Like maybe the water's just too warm and they don't like how warm the water is there. Which, on the face of it seems to make total sense. My one counterpoint would be from working in the Atlantic, there's sharks that spend seemingly their entire lives in the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico, where the water, at least at the surface, is as warm or warmer on a regular basis. So maybe warm temperatures, but maybe not by itself. So back to the sleepless nights. Start looking into the oceanography of the region. So up here on the right, this is a map of the major surface currents in the North Pacific Ocean. I want to draw your attention to the North Equatorial Current here. If we plot on our shark map about where that current is, it's about there, which is interesting because it seems to be about the spot where the sharks tend to turn around. So maybe we're onto something here. So the North Equatorial Current is maybe acting as a boundary. But why? We still haven't come up with a why. I mean, it's an ocean current. Mako sharks swim through other ocean currents. They're not going to drown. So what is it about here that is still kind of acting as sort of this soft boundary that they don't seem to like to go through? So more sleepless nights. Eventually, I stumble upon this map right here. What are we looking at? We are looking at the average amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. And I believe in this map, it's 400 meters down in the water column. So dissolved oxygen, fish need oxygen to breathe. They just pull it out of the water instead of pulling it out of the air like we do. but the amount of oxygen in the water is going to vary from place to place. And this map is showing how oxygen concentration varies. The dark blue is areas with little to no oxygen in the water, all the way up to these like pink and dark red, where there's a lot of oxygen dissolved in the water, which would be available for a fish or another aquatic organism. So that's what we're looking at here. And immediately, you might look at our part of the world and notice something interesting. There is a big blue blotch right about there. There's some other parts of the world that have these as well. They form a lot on the eastern margins of oceans. If you ever talk to an oceanographer and you want to sound cool, they're called oxygen minimum zones, or OMZs. Go talk to an oceanographer, mention oxygen minimum zone. They'll think you're cool. So these areas form. The reason that they tend to form is if you know on the eastern sides of the oceans, that's where a lot of the upwelling occurs. Like if you've been to California, the water's kind of cold there. It's because the water's being upwelled from the depths. That water that comes up is generally cold. It also generally doesn't have a lot of oxygen in it. The water way down at the bottom of the ocean is generally not full of a lot of oxygen. So in the eastern part of the oceans, that water gets pulled up towards the surface, and then the currents kind of drag it out to the west a bit. There's also some biology going on. Those waters are very productive, so there's lots of plankton and other things, and that kind of eats through some oxygen as well. But if you sort of take a look at the Pacific oxygen minimum zone, which is the largest and the strongest one, and you compare it to where the sharks go, you start to see a pattern in there, right? Kind of looks like where the low oxygen is, kind of seems like it's the boundary of where the sharks are, at least in the south part of their range here. So, and this finger that goes off to the west, well, that's where the North Equatorial Current is. So, uh-huh. So being a good scientist, you look and see what other researchers have done and found, and you look at, over these oxygen minimum zones, does it affect how fish move? And there's been studies done with blue sharks, with marlin, with sailfish, with tuna, that have looked at the movement and the habitat use of fish like over these oxygen minimum zones. And what we see is this phenomena that called habitat compression. Again, if you want to sound like a cool person talking to a pelagic fish biologist, mention that, they'll think you're cool. So here's the way this works. You're a fish, you live in the ocean, you're a pelagic fish up near the top of the water, you've got temperature requirements and amount of oxygen that you need. So there is some portion of the water column, between the surface and somewhere where the water doesn't have enough oxygen for you or is too cold, this amount of the water column is suitable habitat for you. In the portions of the world over these oxygen minimum zones where this cold water without a lot of oxygen shoals up and it's really close to the surface, well, that compresses, the amount of suitable habitat in the water column. And you'll see that, a lot of these animals will really restrict their depth use. Like they're really like stuck in that top little part of the water column. Because if they go down too deep, the water's really cold and if they can't breathe, there's not a lot of oxygen down there. But that being said, with the other species I talked about, the blue sharks, the marlin, the sailfish, we haven't seen that really geographically stop them, right? They still swim over these oxygen minimum zones. There's some evidence that some species do it on purpose, because this also concentrates the prey into a small area. But our mako sharks are a little different, right? Like our mako sharks seem to be stopped by the oxygen minimum zone. So what's the difference here? So putting some stuff together, the story I came up with is, okay, maybe it's the combined effects of low dissolved oxygen, which is what DO means, and the fact that the surface temperatures are really warm? Why do I think it's the combined effects of both of those? So again, you go back to what you know about the animal and you do some reading on other research. Remember earlier we talked about how sharks are warm-bodied sharks. Well, being warm-bodied sharks, or again, if you're with a shark person and you want to impress them, tell them that you know mako sharks are regional endotherms, and they'll probably invite you on a date or something. Because they're warm-bodied, they might be susceptible to overheating if they spend a prolonged amount of time in warm water. Like if you were to go out on a 90-degree day and just run around a soccer field all day out in the open, you'd overheat as well. So, it's possible that mako sharks, they go into warm water, but, maybe they need to go reach cooler water every once in a while. Start reading a bit more. We talked about how mako sharks are the fastest shark. What comes along with that is they also have the highest metabolic rate of any shark. So what this means with this high metabolism, besides the fact that they look great in a bikini all year and can eat all the ice cream that they want, high metabolic rate tends to equal very high oxygen demands. So you need a lot of oxygen to fuel that motor, which means it makes sense that, well, maybe these sharks are particularly sensitive to low oxygen conditions. Putting these together, we came up with a hypothesis for why the sharks do not pass through the North Equatorial currents. And it's this combination of the warm surface temperatures and the inability to go access cooler temperatures to cool down, right? So you got a shark over the OMZ. You got this shallow surface layer, which is great to hang out for a time, but it's warm because we're in the tropics. And then the cooler water is very cold, but it's also inaccessible because it's got very low oxygen for an animal that needs a lot of oxygen. So it's kind of like the room with the AC, the door is closed. Or you could go into the room with the AC, but there's no oxygen. And no one wants to be in a room with lots of AC, but no oxygen, right? So the sharks, they move south, they kind of hit where this oxygen minimum zone is up near the surface. And it's uncomfortable, right? They're really warm, they can't cool down without not being able to breathe. They basically say, this sucks, I'm turning around. So that's the hypothesis for why I was thinking, okay, these sharks don't go past this area. So it's cool to come up with a hypothesis, but a hypothesis means nothing unless you can throw some data at it and test it. So how can you test the hypothesis like this? Unfortunately, you can't take the Eastern North Pacific and bring it into a laboratory and do some controlled experiments. But if you're creative, you can sort of design a natural experiment. So here's the world with the ocean concentration again. If you remember earlier in the talk, I had shown the movement data of the sharks in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, that kind of sets up a bit of an experiment to make some comparisons, right? So we have sharks in the Eastern North Pacific, where we have this oxygen minimum zone and my hypothesis about them not going past here. But we also have a pretty rich movement data set of sharks in the North Atlantic, where the temperatures range is similar, but we don't have these oxygen limitations. So these data were collected by the Gar-Harvey Research Institute, Nova Southeastern University, and the University of Rhode Island. I worked for GHRI before I came to the University of Missouri, so some of these black dots are sharks that I helped tag. And then here's the data in the Pacific that was collected by NOAA. So we can kind of start to maybe test this hypothesis by comparing the habitats that the shark uses in both of these locations. And just some acronyms that'll show up for parts of this talk. ENP is Eastern North Pacific, WNA is Western North Atlantic. Okay, so let's start looking at some of the comparisons here. Okay, first off, I made this map in base R, and for those of you that know, I'm kind of proud of that. So we got our sharks, 59 sharks here, 87 sharks here. This top panel, what you're looking at is the sharks overlaid on the average dissolved oxygen concentration 100 meters below the surface of the water. The bottom panel, you're looking at the sharks overlaid on the average sea surface temperature of the water. So when you see SST, that's sea surface temperature. That's the temperature of the water right at the surface. So let's just take a look at these figures and compare and contrast what we see here. So focusing up on the oxygen map up here, these contour lines that you see, the blue is where the oxygen is 3 milliliters per liter. You'll see that come up a bunch. The reason we picked looking at that is because that seems to be where it's expected that these type of large creatures would start to get oxygen stressed. And then the white line is 1 milliliter per liter. So a few things to notice. If you look at this figure up here, and again, the red in this figure is low oxygen, the blue is high oxygen. You'll notice that throughout our portion of the Western North Atlantic, oxygen availability, even 100 meters down, is relatively high. Whereas in the Pacific, you can clearly see where that oxygen minimum zone has shoaled up near the surface. So remember, this is all at 100 meters down in the water column. And you can kind of see the contour of where the sharks are relative to the oxygen minimum area. But you might also notice that, it seems like some of the oxygen, there's low oxygen sort of up the coast here, which is true. If we focus on temperature, we got two contour lines here just to make it easier to compare apples to apples across the oceans. We picked this line of 26 degrees Celsius because that kind of seems to be towards the upper range of the temperatures that mako sharks like to be in. And then 14 degrees Celsius because that sort of seems to be near the lower range of the temperatures that mako sharks kind of like to be in. So in the Atlantic, as I said before, we regularly see sharks use these areas here with like really high sea surface temperatures. This area here off the Yucatan Peninsula, the sharks have been tagged there, and they just spend all year there. It's some of the warmest water in the world. Here in the Pacific, you see this stronger relationship with temperature, but again, to the point is looking at the sharks in the Atlantic, without looking at this, you would think, oh, temperature is the reason these sharks don't move past here. But in other places, they regularly do. The sharks in the Pacific don't use the areas with high surface temperatures as often, despite similar temperatures being available to them in both oceans. So this kind of gets at okay, it's not the temperature by itself or the oxygen by itself. It's them combining to sort of form this barrier. So these are like average conditions, and we know that things change seasonally throughout the year. So we can go kind of month by month and see how this sort of shakes out where the sharks were and what the conditions were. And it would be good if we could kind of come up with, okay, what do we consider an area where habitat compression would be really strong? That would be an area that might be unsuitable for the sharks. And so that's kind of what we plotted on these figures here. So to break down what you're looking at, for each of these months, the yellow areas are parts of the ocean where we observe the sharks going and moving through. So anytime there's yellow, like that, there was at some point there was a shark there that month. These red lines, these sort of polygons that you see over here, and mostly in the Pacific, what these areas cover, anything in these red areas, this is an area where for that month, the average sea surface temperature is at least 26 degrees Celsius. And the amount of oxygen available 100 meters down is 3 milliliters per liter or less. So these red areas highlight the spots where the surface is really warm, and that hypoxic zone where there's not a lot of oxygen is close to the surface. Notice that in the Western Atlantic, those conditions basically don't exist. Like the sharks in the Western Atlantic are just not dealing with that situation, but they are in the Pacific. And if you look month by month at the southern edge of where the sharks tend to travel in the Pacific, for the first 6 months here, you can see that it lines up pretty well with where those areas of like high compression would be over the oxygen minimum zone. And we did some statistical analyses, and we found that in the Pacific, we had really strong evidence that their movements weren't random, and that they were actively avoiding moving through these zones. We can do the other 6 months of the year. Once you get June, July, August, September, a lot of the sharks in the Pacific migrate north with the warming temperatures further north, and so that the correspondence with that compression zone breaks down a little bit, but then as the sharks start to move back down south towards the winter again, you see, they kind of hit that area. And it's not a hard barrier, right? There's some holes in the fences, but they don't go into there very often, and they normally don't stay over there very long. So cool, right? This kind of seems to support the hypothesis. So let's break it down, and let's look under the water and see what's going on there. Okay, so to show what this looks like in the Pacific, we got this figure. I'll take a second to explain what we're looking at here, because there's a lot of colors and lines and dots. Imagine you were to get on a boat. We hired you, we put you on a boat. We said, you are going to start here, a little below 5 degrees north latitude, and you are going to travel north up to about 20 degrees latitude. You're going to cross over the North Equatorial Current while you do it. You're going to start below the North Equatorial Current, cross over it. And as you go, you are going to record water temperature and the dissolved oxygen in the water column. And then you're going to go over here, and you're going to repeat that. What's shown on these bottom figures would be the results of you doing that. So for going left to right on these bottom figures, this is starting south and going north. And then from the surface down to 300 meters, we've got the colors represent the temperature in the water column. The black line, anything below this black line, deeper than this black line, the dissolved oxygen is less than that 3 milliliters per liter. Anything below this white line, the dissolved oxygen is less than 1 milliliter per liter. And then these dashed dots that you see, they correspond with here on this figure, and they correspond with here on this figure. They are the furthest southern location that we had ever observed a mako shark traveling. So on this line here, as you travel north, you can see that here, about where the North Equatorial Current is where that cold water with low oxygen gets closest to the surface, and also where in the tropics, so the surface water is really warm. And you can see anything to the right of this dashed line, mako sharks travel and hung out there, but they never kind of crossed over this hump. And then here, this other transect, you kind of see the same pattern. You can see the area where that oxygen minimum zone, it kind of gets shunted up really close to the surface. To the right of this line, mako sharks here, but they don't cross over this hump. Notice how warm the surface is. Notice how close to the surface this low oxygen area is here. In this case, less than 100 meters deep. So if you're a shark and you're traveling south, things are good, things are good. You hit this area of high compression, and you might just be like, hey, this kind of sucks. I'm going to turn around. Why don't the sharks in the Atlantic have this similar issue? We can compare two locations. Let's compare the Atlantic and the Pacific. So we got this green dot here off the Yucatan Peninsula, and we got this blue dot here in the Pacific Ocean. The thing about these two locations is that they have on average the same sea surface temperature. So at the surface of the water, the oxygen and the temperature is the same. We need to look under the water to see what's going on. This area here by the green dot is a spot that is heavily used by mako sharks. Some sharks travel there for part of the year. Some sharks live there all of the year off the Yucatan Peninsula by Isla Mujeres. So it's a warm area that mako sharks use like crazy. This is kind of the southern part of where sharks travel in the Pacific. So this figure down here, the green is the Atlantic, the blue is the Pacific. And what this figure is showing, like let's say you started at the surface and you took a thermometer in your hand and you started swimming straight down and you were recording the temperature as you went down. The green line is what the temperature is at any given depth here in the Gulf of Mexico. And the blue line would be what you recorded as you went down in this part of the Pacific Ocean. And then this figure is the same idea. You start on the surface with an oxygen meter and you start diving straight down and you're recording the oxygen concentration as you go until you get down to 250 meters. The green line is what the oxygen concentration is at any given depth in the Gulf of Mexico. And the blue is what the oxygen concentration is at any given depth out here at the edge of the North Equatorial Current. What you probably notice is that once you start going down, these lines for both of these parameters get different pretty quick. So we can see that it's highly stratified in the Pacific, right? There's these two different water layers that are near each other and aren't mixing very well. If anyone out there is a fisherman, you probably know this as like a thermocline, right? This really strong gradient where the temperature is warm, and then over a short depth range, it crashes down. In the Caribbean, the temperature decreases, but it's a bit more steady. And then you can see the same thing with the oxygen, where as you start to go down, your oxygen plummets really quickly. So why can sharks hang out here and not over here? Well, let's say that you're a shark and you're in the tropical Atlantic and you're up near the surface and you're doing mako shark things. You're chasing tuna, you're being cool, doing all the cool mako shark stuff, jumping, for cameras and all that. But the water's pretty toasty up there and you're getting a little warm and you want to hit the AC. So if you're a shark and you need to hit the AC, what do? Well, you swim down to where it might be cooler. So if you're the shark in the tropical Atlantic and you want to cool off a bit, well, you swim downwards. And let's say you go down 200 meters. So there you are. What are you facing for conditions? Well, the water temperature is about 17 degrees Celsius, which is right in sort of what seems to be the preferred range for what mako sharks like. And dissolved oxygen is above that 3 milliliter per liter mark. So there seems to be plenty of oxygen down there. So you can hang out down there for a little bit. You can cool down a little bit, and then you can go back up to the surface and go back chasing tuna and doing all the cool mako shark stuff. What if you're this shark here in the Pacific? So again, you're at the surface, you're chasing tuna, you're doing cool mako shark stuff, you're getting a little bit toasty. You want to go hit the AC, so you start to travel down. Let's just go half as deep as our Atlantic shark. Let's go down 100 meters. What are you dealing with? Well, now you're at 14 degrees Celsius, which is not a temperature shark makos can't handle, but it's getting towards the lower end of the range they seem to like. And importantly, look at how low the oxygen is there. Like you're having a tough time if you're a mako shark and you need a lot of oxygen. So these sharks in the Atlantic, they can live in these really warm areas because they have the ability to go hit the AC. They can dive down to where it's cool and they can hang out there and get rejuvenated and then go back up to the surface when they need to. And we've got some data of sharks moving in the water column that supports that, yeah, the sharks over there, they do that. They kind of make these deep dives into cooler water for a little while and then they come back and hang out near the surface. In the Pacific, like that's just not a viable strategy, right? The compression over that oxygen minimum zone, like you just can't escape into that colder water because the oxygen is just it's not there. So to show you like what I mean in the Atlantic, we can go back to some of my data from earlier um, in warm areas of the Atlantic Ocean. And for the sharks, when they're not in the belly of another shark or the tag's not floating, you can see that when they get into portions of the ocean, that where it's really warm near the surface, they do start to make these deeper dives. They kind of go down really quick, spend some time in colder waters, and then come back towards the surface. You can see this shark. This shark was regularly making trips down almost 800 meters deep, and then it would come back up, right? So it would go down, it would cool off for a little bit. Maybe forage down there. There could be some squid or some stuff as well, and then it would come back up to the surface. Um, in the Pacific, if you're in the parts where there's warm water, and you're a mako shark, man, it's going to be rough for you down 800 meters, right? There's just not going to be that much oxygen there. In fact, we've got some vertical movement data for sharks in the Eastern North Pacific, and these graphs are a little bit complicated, but the main idea here is when we look at the 33 sharks we had in the Pacific that did have those PSAT tags and the spot tags, so we could see where they were and how they were moving in the water column. Each of these colored lines represents how much time during the day the shark would be expected to spend either within the first 50 meters of the water column, 50 to 100 meters down, 100 to 150 meters down, or 150 to 200 meters down. We very rarely ever saw these sharks go much below 200 meters, like ever. And then you say, okay, if I'm going to swim down, how far do I go before I reach that area of low oxygen? In this graph, that low oxygen, let's say it's 50 meters below the surface. You'll see that these sharks, they just don't use these deeper depths. Whereas in situations where we take that low oxygen zone and we push it down to 250 meters, especially as the sea surface gets warmer, you'll find that the amount of time they spend near the surface decreases a little bit, even though they spend most of their time there. And they start to make use of these deeper depth ranges. So they does seem like the low oxygen in the Pacific does, limit how far, they can go in the water column regularly. Whereas in the Atlantic, they don't really have that limitation, right? They can go down to cooler water because there's plenty of oxygen for them. So in terms of the hypothesis, did we find data to support it? I like to think so. This paper was published last year, so at least some reviewers and associate editors think so. And then I asked my good friend Goku, and he thought so. And so when a Super Saiyan says that you've done a good job, that's good for me. Okay, so that's hopefully you find that to be a cool story, but like what are some of the implications of this? What does this mean going forward, besides being a cool story about mako sharks? As you're aware, we live in just the worst timeline. And one of the consequences of climate change is deoxygenation of the ocean and the expansion of these oxygen minimum zones, in terms of how close they are to the surface and sort of the footprint of the ocean that they take up, because of course. So what does this mean for the mako sharks or other things in general? If these oxygen minimum zones expand, that might contribute to habitat loss over time. And then another kind of important thing to take away from this, I think, kind of bigger picture, is that, people try to predict what the effects of climate change might be on the distribution of species in the ocean, right? How might their ranges maybe shift in the face of climate change? And traditionally, a lot of the modeling that was done for that would take into account temperature, obviously. It would take into account things like forage availability. But I think what this kind of brings home is that, and this is starting to be recognized more and more, is that we really need to account for potential changes in oxygen, as well as all that to hopefully make more accurate predictions of how ranges of animals might shift in the face of climate change. And to this first point here, um, how might this contribute to habitat loss? Go back to our map of ocean oxygen, and let's enhance and zoom in on the eastern North Pacific here, right? So we kind of know that in this part of the ocean, this is where the mako sharks tend to hang out. Um, they're not an Arctic species. They can handle cold water for a little bit, but they're not going to go into like glacially cold water. So there's kind of an upper limit about where the sharks go. Let's say that this oxygen minimum zone here, right, it starts expanding. Well, that might, you know, push the sharks, the southern range of where they're comfortable up a little bit. And depending on how much of this barrier moves or doesn't move, you might wind up with this sort of latitudinal, contraction of, what is the suitable area for a mako shark in the East Pacific. So, there might be this potential loss of habitat, or at least more stress put on the animals. Another thing that this might do is it might enhance potential population fragmentation, right? So right now, mako sharks in the Pacific, seem to be one population. So there are some places where sharks are moving across the equator. Although if you look at the genetics, there is some variation where it does seem like there's kind of a northern population, kind of a southern population, um, you know, on different sides of the equator, but there is some mixing. Like the two populations do mix enough. If something like this becomes severe, it might sort of fragment. Even though you're in the open ocean and you don't see any land barriers, these kind of things can still lead to sort of like population isolation, potentially in the open ocean. And if you're a fan of wolves, you know how that can be an issue. It's an issue for sharks and other things as well. So I've yapped for a while. I'm gonna kind of wrap it up there. I need to thank a bunch of people though. These are all people that I've worked with and helped collect the data that you saw all throughout this talk. We got Heidi and Eric from NOAA, Jeremy and Mahmood from NOVA and Guy Harvey, Brad Weatherby from the University of Rhode Island. Misha Schultz was my grad student who is now at LSU getting her PhD. And then James Sulikowski at Oregon State University. And my throat hurts because I've been talking for an hour, and I will take a drink. And I guess this is the part where I answer questions, if you have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. For anyone who might have joined a bit late, please put any questions that you have into the Q&A box. We'll be going through those, and my colleague, Dr. Joey Hinton, will be moderating the Q&A. So if you do have any questions you would like answered, please put them into the Q&A box. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, we got some questions here. Some folks will probably be sending some more questions in shortly. So I guess one that I have for you while folks are entering questions is, with the habitat compression forcing makos up to the surface, does that make them more susceptible to fish and mortality where they wind up in ports? Have you guys correlated that data? It's kind of like roads with wolves. The more roads you put in there, they use them and they just make contact with humans.
So short answer is yes. I haven't studied that with mako sharks, but that has definitely been seen with other fish. Like in the Atlantic, where the oxygen minimum zone is there. It does seem like exactly that reason, right? Because it's a smaller amount of area you have to fish. Everything's compressed there, so like catches of tuna and things tend to be increased. I think bycatch of blue sharks increases. So yeah, that definitely is another issue with these habitat compression zones.
That's kind of what I was figuring when you were showing that compression. I was like, yeah, they're running right into those lures.
Yeah, right. You don't gotta like, well, how deep do I need to set this? Well, it's it's much shorter.
Yeah, we have a question in there. It's tied to climate change and basically how it's going to affect those surface, I guess, oxygen or temperature circulations or whatever. And Yeah, so those surface currents as they change, do you guys have any? I mean, I know you touched into it a little bit, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to expand on that question. As the climate warms, those currents change. It's going to affect the distribution of oxygen and temperature in the oceans, and what kind of effect is that going to have on shark conservation, and what you guys are doing?
Oh man, that's a big question. I'll preference this with not an oceanographer, but I can hang out with them on occasion. So yeah, like trying to predict what climate change is going to do is not my area of expertise, but like I was saying, one of the things that we have actually seen is, the ocean is kind of losing oxygen, generally speaking. Um, and these oxygen minimum zones, I can't speak as much to the current changing. That's not as much my, I can say what I know, but I'm not the expert and I don't want to say anything stupid by accident. Um, but the oxygen minimum zones, what we're seeing is in some places, they're becoming kind of more severe. So like they're shoaling closer to the surface. There's just less oxygen. So there was a study, one of these, actually I can go back through my talk and probably figure out which one it was. Kill. Wait. Was it? There we go. I think it was this study right here. Had This was in the Atlantic, and I forget the exact number, but they actually calculated over a 20-year period, like how much habitat was lost for billfish. Like they were looking at marlin and sailfish, and they actually calculated, man, I forget the exact number, but just the amount of the ocean that was usable in that part of the world had decreased like noticeably even over a 20-year period. Hopefully that answered it somehow.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat of a different answer than what you were describing in terms of like shifting the Mako's habitat further north or forcing them further north and maybe hitting that northern limit. So yeah, so one of the questions I guess was like, with wolves, climate change isn't really a thing that's going to affect them. It's more, human caused mortality. And in this case, sharks are getting hit with both, right? They're getting overfished and then their habitats are getting altered. I didn't know if you had any comments in terms of is it a more balanced threat between the two, or is there one that's, if we just dealt with fishers and regulated harvest, would that be more beneficial long term than, I mean, we're not going to be able to fix the climate change stuff in the short term.
Yeah, especially not for the next few years. But I mean, especially in the Atlantic, the fishing is by far like first priority, get in check. And like I said, there is some action being taken on that front. So ICAT, just I think in the last month did they did a stock assessment in 2017. I know because I was actually there when they did it, which was cool. And they did their like every 7 years about they redo it. So they just did one. I think they met in June. I wasn't there, and I haven't seen the result of that stock assessment yet to see if there's been like a big change between now and then. I would expect maybe not because they take so long to mature and grow that it would take a while for those effects to be seen. But at least in the Atlantic, there's some action being done to kind of reduce that fishing mortality, which really is like that's the main thing. And then the climate change is going to affect most things, but it's a little harder to wrap our mind around right now.
I was going to say, when you were showing the catches going back to the ports, we don't see that with red wolves because they're illegally killed and they just cut collars or whatever. Leave them out there. We see that with coyotes when they're harvested. My data, like they wind up in someone's driveway or a woodshed. You know how it is. Like
Oh yeah, I think all of us that have tracked terrestrial animals have had it's transmitting from this guy's garage. That's interesting.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay, so let's look at some of these questions then. So one is about like do you find that sharks migrate together or separately? So yeah, I mean, do you have any cool like, I guess, information about like interspecific interactions with sharks and how they interact with each other out there, other than they getting eaten bit by a bigger one? That was pretty cool.
Yes, some of them get eaten by bigger ones. There was one. Man, it's hard to say. Like it'd be really hard to collect that because you go out there and you tag sharks, and it's a big open ocean, you just get what you can get. My guess would be for mako sharks at least. For some other species, this might be different. Like there's some species that we know form aggregations. Like there's big aggregations of like hammerhead sharks you can go dive with in the Pacific Ocean. But like for mako sharks and some of these more open ocean type critters, what I think happens is sometimes they get concentrated in certain areas. Outside of mating, maybe not because they want to hang out with another mako shark, but maybe just because the conditions are good in this spot and it attracts a lot of sharks because it's either favorable to migrate through or there happens to be a lot of food there. But I would not suspect mako sharks are like buddying up and traveling together. I could be wrong. Maybe research in the future would prove that otherwise, but we don't really have any evidence of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. You can't see them. It's not like you can like Yellowstone where you can sit up and
Yeah,
know,
like
pair
the
of field
camera
glasses.
traps don't work. I put them out and then they just stopped.
So we have a couple questions on prey availability with dissolved O2 zones and H2O surface temperatures. Yeah, any insights in there regarding like how this stuff affects prey availability, I guess, for makos?
It's kind of interesting. But that's an interesting question that probably kind of deserves its own research project. But so like in the Pacific, like there are creatures that can go down into the oxygen minimum zone and be fine, and some of the ones that do that are cephalopods like squid. And mako sharks do like them some squid, especially like the Humboldt squid. If you go in the Pacific and you catch mako sharks, you'll see they got like sucker marks on their face from eating like Humboldt squid. The squid fight back. But the mako sharks tend to win because they've opened mako shark stomachs and found like, squid beaks in their stomachs. So it kind of brings those a little closer to the surface. In terms of prey availability, like that sharp like thermocline where that big change is, that does tend to concentrate prey. So it's possible that it could bring some food sources that might not have been available in the past to be more regularly available. So they could access food that they couldn't access as easily in the past. But we have seen, other friends and colleagues of mine did some studies of, they actually had like video cameras on marlin tagged off of like Panama, where that oxygen minimum zone is like really close to the surface. And they had these really like fine scale sensors of like their accelerometry and like their fine scale movement in the water column. And they would go down right to that boundary layer, and that's where they would forage because everything was concentrated there, right? So you have the stuff from that lives in the oxygen minimum zone, plus you got the fish above it. There can be like productivity like boosts there. So seems to be a good spot to forage. And if anyone in the audience is like a fisherman, like like if you got your thing and you see like thermocline, like I'm going to fish there because that's where the predators are going to be, and that seems to be what we see as well. But no one's really studied that specifically with mako sharks. That'd be a cool like new study.
We have one here asking, why are the sharks not continuing on to the Hawaiian Islands? The data shows that they're going out and coming back toward the California coast.
My guess on that would be related to the food availability. So once you get out that way, the waters just become less productive. Whereas along the coast of North America, where the California current is, with all the upwelling, it's very productive. There's lots of fish, there's lots of prey, there's lots of stuff. As you start going out more into the Central Pacific, there's not as much food out there. It's a little bit more like an ocean version of a desert, until you get like right maybe near Hawaii, right? So that would be my guess is that they travel a long way, but they, unless they're following something, it's just not as much food as going towards the coastal. I say coast, but we could still be 100 or 2 miles off the coast in that big upwelling zone. There's just a lot more resources there.
One that goes with sharks and wolves, I guess, like some of our research is focused on the idea of building empathy for wolves to improve tolerance and maybe lower, human cause mortality. When you're in the classroom teaching students or interacting with the public, do you see a change in, I guess, people's perception with sharks? Is there a lot of work that needs to be done? You can see with the Wolf Conservation Center and other nonprofit groups, there's a lot of demand for wolf conservation, and we find a lot of good public support for wolves. Is there anything similar with sharks?
Yeah, I think sharks have come around. There's a bunch of NGOs that, are dedicated to shark conservation, like you guys are for wolf conservation. I think the public in general, I don't want to speak for everybody. It's probably like wolves. There's people that are afraid of sharks, but those people don't go to the ocean very often. And there's people that really love sharks, like me. I think seeing a shark in the wild is probably something that can switch somebody. Like, oh wow, it's not a monster, it's just this cool fish, Um, but there is I kind of lost my train of thought for a second there. But yeah, I mean it's not necessarily particularly my field, it's kind of a human outreach field, but there is a lot of research on how to improve attitudes towards sharks. There are NGOs that are focused on shark conservation specifically. And there's always going to be some people that think the otherwise. Some of the commercial fishermen have a very different view of a mako shark than like I would, or maybe someone in the chat would, right? They see it either as a thing I make money off of or an annoyance, like
I was gonna say,
yeah.
are they like livestock producers? Some of these fishermen, where it's like they're eating into my profits and whatnot. I suppose that's the same there. Okay, so I got one question here. How are the mako and other shark species going to be affected by 4547's decision to open up the Pacific Monument to commercial fishing?
Probably badly.
Yeah.
Which one is that? Which part of the Pacific?
Pacific Monument. I'm not sure where that's at out there.
Is that the Midway or is that somewhere else? Maybe the person can clarify exactly where that is. I live in the middle of the country, man. Sometimes my geography gets away from me.
I guess Regan can Google that, and I'll ask you, find some other questions here. Would habitat loss create a denser concentration in macros and then more northern locations?
Sorry, repeat that one.
Regan, can you put that back up? Oh, it's an answer. She moved it over. So, would habitat loss create a denser concentration in makos and then more northern locations?
Potentially would be the most concrete answer that I can give to that.
I guess on the Pacific side, I don't know on the Atlantic side, whether
on the Pacific side, like that last kind of figure I showed is like, yeah, that's a thing that potentially could happen. But wide confidence intervals on there's a lot of other moving parts, right? Like other species and how other things played out. But yeah, I'd say it's potentially an outcome.
Here's a simple one. What is the average range for the mako?
Oh, that's actually
how long do they live? There's another question. So basically some basic biology questions about them.
Okay. So the first one is not as simple as you think. So they are what's considered a highly migratory species, and they can travel very far distances. I can go back actually put some of the maps up. Oh, wait, there we can use this one. So you can see we got some of these sharks, they're making these like super long journeys, but they don't seem to do that all the time. What's kind of interesting I found is that they have the potential to travel, and they've been tagged and recaptured like on one side of the Atlantic and then like recaptured on the other side of the Atlantic. So they absolutely have the potential to go really, really far distances as individuals. That being said, they do tend to have these areas where they kind of like concentrate, and they will spend a lot of the year or a lot of the time there or a lot of a season there. So the two big examples from this figure here is the mid-Atlantic bite here from like Massachusetts down to North Carolina off the continental shelf. A lot of them some sharks will spend like the whole year in this area. And then there's the California current area, the upwelling area. There's some sharks that will spend a lot of the year there. That being said, there, like even with all this information, there's still a lot we don't know. Like we still don't know where they mate. We don't know where they give birth exactly. You know, we've got ideas on it. So the average range is a little hard to say. I would say what they tend to do is they tend to spend time in parts of the ocean that are really productive, and then occasionally they will move really long distances to another part of the ocean that's productive.
Gotcha. Let's see. I know you answered this at the very beginning, but I don't know if you want to answer it again. It's like, what is your favorite kind of shark?
Oh, shortfin Mako shark. Probably my
Yes.
favorite animal.
Yeah. Um, so there's a question here about the correlation between what the Makos are going through and what other sharks are going through in terms of what you're describing. So is this unique just to Makos, or is this something that you're seeing with, you know, is it broadly across the shark species, I guess, out there in the ocean? Or is
Like
it,
the
I'm
oxygen
assuming,
stuff.
yeah, I'm assuming, is it affecting just a certain group, a taxonomic group of sharks, or is it something that's affecting, is there like sharks that are not bothered by it?
You are describing an NSF proposal I'd like to write. So we don't know exactly for a lot of other sharks, but some interesting things I can point out is someone had kind of studied a similar thing in the Atlantic Ocean and the East Atlantic for blue sharks. And they found that they were not avoiding the areas where the oxygen minimum zone was. In fact, it seems like they were traveling to those areas where there was like the oxygen was low to the surface, with the thought being that again, it like it aids foraging, right? It's like it's a productive place to feed because all your food is there. But they also showed that that's where fishers were catching them as bycatch the most. So an interesting study I'd like to do would be kind of to expand this, but to include blue sharks, for example, which live in a lot of the same areas, but they're very different, like in how they operate and their physiology, and you know they eat slightly different things. Um, they seem to be more tolerant of cold water. They seem to be more tolerant of low oxygen conditions than mako sharks. So it'd be interesting to look into them a little bit deeper. One thing I really would love to do would be to work with some physiologists and kind of come up with these cool models to predict like how, you know, what's the physiological like quality, let's say, of different parts of the ocean. And then go to South America on the other side of this zone, you know, make predictions, then go tag mako sharks and blue sharks there and see if we see the same patterns on the South Pacific. Because if, you know, if what we think's going on here is correct, we should see a similar thing happen down here in the, you know, south of the equator as well.
There's one question here. She's saying she came in a bit late. But is it normal for there to be low levels of oxygen in parts of the ocean, say before the climate crisis? And what factors cause these fluctuations in oceanic oxygen levels? So yeah, are these, I guess, minimum oxygen zones natural, and how they, I guess, fluctuate under normal conditions that are not produced by anthropogenic climate change?
Yeah, they are natural. So if it came in late, what I tried to explain was let me find a bigger map here. Glad I didn't X out map on PowerPoint. Okay, apparently, there we go. Okay. So these tend to form naturally on the eastern parts of the oceans, and it's related to ocean circulation patterns. So what happens, and we'll use the Pacific Ocean, is you have these currents that come, the California current from north to south, and then a similar currents here in the South Pacific, and they move out this way. And what they do is they cause upwelling along the coasts on the eastern parts of the oceans. Um, normally the water with low oxygen is the deeper parts of the ocean. But here, because of the upwelling, that pulls that low oxygen water up closer to the surface. So you get these low oxygen zones closer to the surface naturally because of how ocean circulation works. And there's some biological processes that can kind of exacerbate it beyond there. So yeah, this is a natural thing, and there's a little bit of natural fluctuation. As climate changes, the nature of how this stuff works is probably going to change a little bit as well. But yeah, like these are natural things that can fluctuate as the climate and the Earth system and the ocean circulations change as well.
We have one comment about or questions about your thoughts about the Ocean Ramsey's tours to teach tolerance to people and to learn not to fear sharks. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
I've seen her on social media. I think there was just a documentary that I haven't seen. Um, I have mixed feelings. Um, do you remember Timothy Treadwell, the bear guy?
Mhm.
I feel like we're heading towards a situation like that. On the one hand, I think it's cool to show that like sharks are, you know, awareness and they're not monsters. I'm fearful that when she does have a bite taken out of her by a tiger shark, it's going to undo a lot of that.
This is the first time I've heard of her. I don't, yeah, so good to know. This one here is they've developed an obsession with with the Greenland shark,
Healthy
specifically about their
obsession.
yeah, specifically about their longevity. Do you know much about them? Is there anything you can share to feed my obsession, or any info on shark longevity in general? Yeah, because I'd written down something about like, yeah, life history traits and what particular life history traits make these things susceptible to like anthropogenic mortality and being extirpated. So that longevity would play into it. Yeah. So
Yeah, I think actually someone answered that and I totally forgot to answer it. So yeah, if you're obsessed with Greenland sharks, you might, our knowledge might be kind of similar, and maybe you could tell me some things about them. I know they live for literally hundreds of years. There's Greenland sharks out there right now that like are older than the country of America. They're Greenland sharks, that were there like before the Victorian era. These things were swimming around out there. There were Greenland sharks that were swimming around out there before some of the giant redwood trees were growing in California, which is like kind of nuts to think about. Um, yeah, they're really cool. A lot of them, when they get that old, are blind because there's a parasite that attacks their eyes. So kind of a weird, fascinating creature. Very, very different from a mako shark. Mako sharks are high metabolism, fast critters. Greenland sharks are like the exact opposite. Low metabolism, slow critters. They're very cool. I don't know if I can offer much that you don't already know about them, though, if you are a super fan. So yeah, longevity. Um, Mako sharks, they're probably not living as long as Greenland sharks. Um, but like white sharks, which are very closely related, we've got evidence that make that white sharks can live up to 60 to 80 years. And I would imagine mako sharks are pretty similar like that. So they could probably live probably up towards that 60, 80 year mark. So yeah, they're very much the case selected for the ecology nerds out there. They take a long time to grow up. They live for a long time. They don't produce a lot of young. Um, so they're kind of on that edge of things.
all right, we got to start wrapping up, I think. So I guess just a few more questions. Is there a comfort zone that the Makos seem to prefer?
Yeah, so they can tolerate a wide range of temperatures, but there does seem to be sort of a zone that they are most comfortable in. And we get this data from like the PSAT data where we can see where they move in the water column. So we can see like, oh, they've got a choice of temperatures, kind of where do they spend? And it kind of seems to be like the sweet spot seems to be like, I'd say like 16 to 25 degrees Celsius. And then it kind of peters off from there. But like we've had sharks You know, in the Caribbean, sometimes they're in sea surface temperatures that are up in like 30 degrees Celsius, 35 degrees Celsius. And then we've had ones on the Labrador Current where, you know, the sea surface temperature was like 11 degrees Celsius. So they're pretty tough. They can tolerate, I think, a wide range of temperature. I think if there's food, they'll kind of tough it out. But they're kind of their sort of preferred range seems to be that like 16, 17 to like mid 20 degrees Celsius.
Um, one last one, I guess, well, two more, but this will be one from the last. Why do the areas near the poles have so much dissolved oxygen? I don't know if you got into that.
I as a not oceanographer, my guess is going to be it's got to do with the fact that the water is cold, so cold water does tend to hold more oxygen if it's near the surface and it gets mixed. The reason the cold water and these oxygen minimum zones don't have much oxygen is because that's water that's been down in the deep ocean and doesn't get mixed in with oxygen a lot. So that's probably part of the reason. So it's probably got something to do with mixing turbulence and the fact that the cold water can just, from a chemistry perspective, can just hold more oxygen than warm water.
All right. I guess the last one's just be sort of conservation sort of question in terms of like, how can fishermen and whatnot avoid catching makos? So if they, I guess it's more of like concluding, like what would you suggest to folks in terms of what they can do to, I guess, improve shark conservation and how we can press for, I guess, in this case, to, mitigate these commercial and sportsman sort of mortalities and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean the commercial fishing's a little tough because you know, they'll catch them by accident if they're not targeting them, and like it's never going to be able to like eliminate that completely. It's just kind of the cost of doing business out there. But you know, there are steps that fishers could take to reduce their probability of catching a lot of them. You know, and it gets into like how deep they set their lines and the day versus the nights. If they're using glow sticks, the type of bait. There's been some research done on this on like, okay, what could be done to that a fisher could do if he's on his boat and he's got to go fishing or she's got to go fishing. Like, what steps can they take to reduce the probability they're going to get a mako? And it's things like how deep they're going to, if you fish really deep in the middle of the day, you seem to be less likely to catch a mako. People sometimes use glow sticks for sword fishing off the Northeast coast. It seems like, not using the light sticks might reduce mako shark catch. Beyond what a fisher could do themselves, then you run into the options of like time area closures where, there would be an agency that comes in and says, okay, like no long line fishing in this area during these months, right? Because this is where there's a lot of makos, which would probably be the best thing to reduce the catch, but would probably also be the most unpopular thing for the fishers. Like there was a similar thing. So swordfish, for example, off the east coast of Florida, there's this portion of the east coast of Florida that's a no-go zone for pelagic longlining because it's the swordfish spawning area. And that has been, it's like super productive. Like swordfish populations were not doing too good back in the day, and now they've bounced back a lot. So that would be another sort of way to tackle that. But politically, it would be much more difficult.
Cool. Thank you. Regan, I don't know if there's anything we need to.
No, I think just huge thanks to Mike. Mike, I know you haven't been able to keep an eye on the chat, but everyone's giving you rave reviews, saying must be a wonderful teacher to your students. People enjoyed the humor. So really, thank you so much for offering some time to everyone to learn about yet another apex predator that's facing a lot of challenges. And folks, just a reminder, we will be posting a recording on our website and on our YouTube channel as well. But we really appreciate all of you for joining. And once again, huge thanks to Mike and shout out to those mako sharks.
Heck yeah, mako sharks.
Awesome.
All right,
Thanks
all
so
right,
much, Mike. Thanks everyone for joining. Have a great night, everyone.
Yep, later.